Hello and welcome everyone to Copy and Paste, the clean and family-friendly Reddit reading podcast. This is the 4th episode of r/ProRevenge. And yes, you did hear me correctly. We're on the 4th rotation, let's go! It only seems like this year since the start of this podcast. Please don't forget to leave a comment or send me an audio message if you want to recommend another subreddit. And don't forget, the usernames for all posts will be in the description, as always. Thank you for joining me. Okay, let's get started. Our first post is made by user/Kurorosu. I do have many stories peppered throughout my life that I want to share, but this was the first one that came to mind. This one has to do with my childhood and dealing with a psychotic and racist aunt and uncle. When I was a child, I was often assaulted and bullied for being a mixed blood kid by both my own family and kids in school. There are many things that my aunt and uncle did to me and got away with, which I will share the highlights of later. This story, however, is not one of those. My uncle was the alpha tormentor between the two. Both my aunt and uncle still lived with my grandparents, so there was no way to avoid them because I had to go to my grandparents' house after school while my dad was still at work. My uncle liked to play quote-unquote games with me in order to turn me into a quote-unquote fearless pit dog, as he put it, when I asked him one day why he was tormenting me so much. When he said that, the fact he was being completely honest as well as smiling about it, I decided right then and there that this man was my enemy and would have to deal with him accordingly. If he wanted a quote-unquote pit dog, he was gonna get one. After overcoming my shock of his honest answer, I said, "Screw you, uncle, just screw you." One of the games that he loved to play was chasing me down the road to my grandparents' house, which felt like an honest attempt to literally run me over. He'd always do this as I was walking home to my grandparents' house after school. Luckily, most times he ended up just chasing me off the road. The game started like this. He would stop his truck at the end of the road that my grandparents' place was on and rev the engine of his truck 3 times. That was a signal that the game was about to begin. After the 3rd rev, he would hit the gas and come screaming down the road towards me. I would have to leap off the road to avoid being run over. After at least a couple of months of dealing with this, I had enough. I was tired of feeling afraid of walking down that street. I thought it was over for a while, before I decided I would get revenge. On the days when I wasn't being chased, I started to count how many steps it took to get to an old stump on the side of the road that was hidden by briars. I'd walk backwards just so I could eye the distance between the end of the road and the stump so I would know when to run. 17 steps. It would take 17 steps from the time he would start roaring down that road at me to get to that stump. The day finally came, about a couple of weeks later. When I heard his truck, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. As per normal, he revved his engine 3 times, then gunned it around the corner. I waited until he was close enough before I ran as fast as I could up the side of the road and behind the stump, throwing my backpack into a deer trail I could jump into in case my plan failed, then quickly turned towards the stump and the oncoming truck bared onto me. As expected, he followed me up the side of the road, too fixed on me to pay attention to where he was going. The next few moments were beautiful. The briars parted like the Red Sea, and to my delight, I saw his eyes go wide as he realized what he was about to smash into. He yanked the steering wheel to the left, his front right tire going over the stump, which launched him into the air. As he flew past me, I could see the look of terror on his face, and grinning madly, I began to shout insults at him, as the truck nearly flipped in midair. Instead of flipping, the truck roughly came back on 4 wheels, and he continued down the road to my grandparents' house and parked in a gravel driveway. I grabbed my backpack, ran up the trail and hid. I didn't come out until after dark, when my dad came to get me. I knew the sound of my dad's car, a Datsun B210, so when I heard him coming up the road, I immediately came out, waved him down, and quickly jumped into the passenger seat. My dad asked me concerned as to why I was out there. At first, I just kept telling him over and over that we need to just go straight home and under no circumstances go to my grandparents' house. When my dad kept asking why, I finally told him everything that happened. Without another word, he turned the car around, silently fuming, and drove us home. I don't know if my dad talked to my uncle after what happened, but what I do know is that game never happened again. That game, at least. I just want to add, that uncle is a lunatic. Our second post is made by user/axelrafn. Since so many people assume this happened in the States, I just want to say that I'm from a small country in Europe. The laws and regulations here are different than in the States. We have a government agency here that has everything to do with registering companies, and they do keep a track of who is who. If you are a serial startup guy who leaves nothing but burnt ashes behind you, you cannot do it here. You have to register the owner and members of the board of the company if there is one. If you have a prior history of failed companies or you've broken the law in some regard, you are blacklisted at the establishment. I worked as an independent contractor in the IT field for over 20 years, doing all manners of things, from creating simple HTML sites to managing a big hotel's complete IT infrastructure. One of the many clients I had back in the day, I was coding biggish custom websites, was a rental company. Now, I had heard a lot of warnings about not working with this guy that owned it. He had a reputation that he was sharp as a tack, backstabbing, and cunning. He was a lawyer after all. So I went into the partnership with that in mind. He wanted a new website for his renting gig, where people would list their home for rent. Renters would sign up and pay a subscription to the site, and he would get the whole lot. Nothing out of the ordinary there. So we make a pretty good deal on paper. We sign it and I get started on the project. Coding everything in PHP goes well, but he demands suddenly that I show him progress, only a week into the progress. He wants to see the website front now. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I tried explaining to him that the front end work isn't scheduled to start until after 6 weeks of back end programming, and that I only had pure code to show him right now. The contract we signed clearly states this. He then gets on his high horse and demands I put everything on hold to do the front end first, design and then program. I, being really young at the time and fairly naive, agreed to this without asking for it to be added to the contract as an addendum and started working on the design now. Now, the contract stated that I was given free reign of the design decisions as long as I maintained the same color scheme and used the same logo on the site. So I make a fast draft in Fireworks. This was back when it was Macromedia product, before the Adobe acquisition. And within 2 days I show him. He's not impressed and demands a different direction and sets up a list of demands. I, as always, aim to please the customer and do just what he wants. I design a new layout with his list of demands, but he doesn't like that either. That's how the next 3 months go. A never-ending circle where he's never happy with anything. Now, close to 4 months into the project, he demands to see a working showcase of the backend. I point out that he himself changed the order in how the project was being done, and had demanded that I do the front-end design first instead of the backend, as stated in the contract, which he now turns on me and says, "Yes, the contract we both signed says you will have a working backend to show me at the end of the month. If you don't honor that, I will have to take my business elsewhere and seek compensation for your lack of professionalism." Okay, I now have 12 days to do the back end for the site. So I get a friend to help me, and we work tirelessly through a weekend, and I have a good base to work from in 9 days. Mind you, at this point, he has only paid the security on the contract, about 5% of the total price, and has shielded himself from paying by hiding behind. Well, if you can't honor the contract, why should I? Finish XX work, and then I'll pay as per the contract. Remembering now all the warnings I had heard about this guy, I decide to add a special function to the code, just to be safe. More on that later. So now it's the end of the month. We have a front-end design he is okay with. A backhand that has been finished to about 85% of what is required according to the contract. And I still have 1 month left to finish everything else. Time for show and tell. Since I was working on this development, I was running it on my own dev server, and showed him this in a browser on his computer. I mentioned to him that since I only had 512 kilobyte a second upstream from the server, it might lag a little, but it weren't when it was put on the production server. He has his website at his hosting company. He says that's okay, and the demonstration goes on. As I'm showing him the site, both front end and back end, I can see he's immensely happy with it, although he would never say so out loud. He is trying to hide his smile that popped up regularly, and his eyes gleam with all the added ways he can now start making money from. Anyway, he now says that it's way too slow. This is wrong, blah blah blah. I want you to put it up on my prod server and see how the speed is. Okay, no problem. I can make that happen. Please pay 50% of the contract and I'll get right on it. Okay. I wait a few days and then I get an email from him where he includes a forwarded message from the bank detailing a transaction from him to me to the amount of the 50% I asked for. So I push the system to his production server so we can take a look at it. Under beta, his domain TLD. I then sent him an email stating that he can try the system with the supplied credential. What he doesn't know is that I knew he had been fishing around for another programmer to do this project, to pick up from a lazy deadbeat who couldn't do anything right. So I knew he would most likely try to screw me. What I also suspected was that the email he sent me with the transaction proof was fake, which it ended up being. ProRevenge number 1. Remember that small function I mentioned? Well, what it did was if user X, his user, tries to remove user Y, my admin, from the system without one setting being changed in the config first, the system will first delete and purge the database, and then remove all the documents in the web root. Well, not 5 minutes after he reads the email from me, he does just that. He tries to delete my admin user from the system to lock me out. Guess what has nothing of the project left? He does! ProRevenge number 2. Since it's considered forgery to spoof an email, especially from a bank, I send the information to the authorities and he goes under investigation by both the police and the bank lawyers. ProRevenge number 3. I sold the system to a competitor of his for a better price than originally contracted him. And last, I knew he was now blacklisted from owning a company, as well as he lost his right to work as a lawyer. I only got that 5% he paid at the beginning for working for just over 5 months of this project. There's hardly anything. But the knowledge of his demise will keep my heart warm for the rest of my life. Unfortunately, that was it for today. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would greatly appreciate you to like and subscribe. To listen to this podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or any more platforms, or to visit any of my socials, click the Linktree link in the description. And please feel free to send me an audio message or leave a comment. It's been a pleasure. Goodbye!